Good evening, I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to tonight's Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations program. Modern culture is much consumed with the brain, and especially the degree to which social environment and biological aspects shape our mental processes and mental health. Well, our guest is a leading authority on the subject, and therefore we welcome distinguished neuroscientist Alan Jasanoff, Professor of Biological Engineering, MIT, and Director of the MIT Center for Neurobiological Engineering. Dr. Jasanoff's new book, The Biological Mind, How Brain, Body, and Environment Collaborate to Make Us Who We Are, underscores the importance of the social environment and the biological factors in the construction of the mind. He's here to explain the making of the mind and the nature-nurture controversy that still prevails. Dr. Jasanoff received his Ph.D. in biophysics from Harvard University. He joined the faculty of the Department of Biological Engineering at MIT in 2004, and today is director of the MIT Center for Neurobiological Engineering and a leader in functional MRI research. We're very honored to welcome Alan Jasanoff. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much.
And we are delighted to get a chance to talk about the brain in a very enlightened way. Could you start us off with just a little background, how you sort of got to this point? What's our traditional view and how are we changing?
Yes, well, so the book is about a phenomenon that I call the cerebral mystique, which is the notion that the brain is a very special organ, that it's an organ that is distinct in some ways from the rest of biology and from the environment around us, in much the same way that a traditional soul was. Mm-hmm. So a lot of us think of the mind as a physical analog to what religions over thousands of years have told us about souls that are immaterial, that transmigrate between bodies. I'm half Indian, so I think about souls moving from body to body, but some think of it as moving between body and heaven. Mm-hmm. We have that embedded in Western philosophy as well. So it's most famously, it's an idea that's most famously associated with the philosopher Descartes, who we associate with a view called dualism. Dualism refers to the separate existence of mind and body and their interaction that brings about the living person, but nevertheless the fact that they can be separable. And dualism is something that most scientists don't believe in anymore, at least not consciously. We believe that the mind comes about through physical interactions that involve the brain and things around it. But one thing that I've been struck by as a neuroscientist working in the field now for close to 20 years is the extent to which attitudes left over from dualism, left over from religious views, are actually still alive in the modern discourse of neuroscience, particularly in the popular sphere, but even also in the professional sphere.
Can you give an example of that? I can think of about a dozen right off the
bat. All right.
That there is a tendency, I would certainly agree, certainly see it all the time, that the brain, the mind is treated very differently. An example is the whole consciousness issue, a lot of things like that.
So I think there's no doubt that key aspects of our minds are somehow embedded in or encoded in our brains, and that frankly we couldn't do anything much. We certainly couldn't do any behavior without our brains. Nevertheless, that sort of the rhetoric around that idea, which I think is true and commonplace, is that is more extreme. It's the idea that we are our brains.
Yes.
That our brains are actually just sort of these, computer-like entities that live in our heads and that basically conduct our mental activities. A lot of people, in fact, like to say that the mind is the software of the brain, as if the brain was this self-contained entity that runs the mind. And that, I think, is sort of the product of this idea that the brain is somehow different from the things around it. That it's different in two ways. One, that it is different in its makeup, that it's somehow autonomous of the surroundings in a way that other physical entities aren't. So for instance, when we shine a light on something, it gets illuminated, we see the reflection back. The light doesn't come out of the thing that we see.
Right.
Similarly, when the brain does something for us, when we do something with our brains inside, it's because there are stimuli going into the brain and sort of working through us to do what we do. So there's a sense that the brain is different in its material and then also in its causal relationship to the world around it. So I talk about these two categories of differences in the book. And on the subject of how we perceive the brain as being different, there are sort of two main ideas about the brain that I think are often emphasized. So one is its sort of inorganic or computational aspect. That the brain works by electricity. We actually know that it works by electricity because we can put electrodes on our heads and measure aspects of brain activity. But what a lot of people don't realize is that actually the reason why those electrical happenings are going on in the brain is actually because of chemicals. And the brain's life, close up, is actually much more about chemicals and much more about sort of wet and slimy things like the rest of our bodies. Than it is about electricity and circuits. And I talk about a couple of examples of sort of, maybe lesser known aspects of neural function, lesser known aspects of brain function in the book. An example is, in fact, the role of chemicals. Many of us know that there's this ancient way of thinking about the body that involved these humors.
Yes,
the four humors.
Yes,
exactly.
right.
Yes, that's right. And we tend to laugh at that, right? Kind of archaic way to think about things. But actually, when you look at how the brain works, well, it's got on the order of 100 humors. We call them neurotransmitters and neuromodulators. They're substances that allow the cells in the brain to communicate with one another. And many of them have very specific roles. So for instance, the most famous neurotransmitters are glutamate and something called GABA, which are contrastingly effective neurotransmitters, one of them that produces excitation, the other one that produces inhibition. And these things act on cells in our brain, but they also, they also diffuse, they also, they have concentrations. There can be more of them in a place and less of them in a place. In a way, you can think of the brain as having ripples of these neurotransmitters, sort of reverberating all around it, as well as the little electrical effects that they're related to. So neurotransmitters and neuromodulators are really important. There are also many cells in the brain, actually about half of them, that are not electrically active at all. And the importance of these cells to some extent challenges the notion of the brain as this electrical computing organism or organ.
The glial?
Yeah. Yes, the glial cells.
A lot of interest in that now.
Exactly. So glial cells are the word glia comes from the Greek word for glue. And glial cells were originally thought to just be supportive, basically just to hold the thing together. That is part of their role, but then again, so are the neurons. You can't have a brain without neurons either.
Exactly,
What's become clear in recent years is how important the glia are for various functions that are super important for how brains work. So for instance, I mentioned neurotransmitters before. The neurotransmitter glutamate gets released by neurons, and it allows one neuron to signal the next one. But it turns out that it also signals to glia, or at least it interacts with glia. Glia take it up, and that's actually part of the process that limits communication in the brain. If you didn't have the glia there, well, that kind of communication would be a totally different thing. It would probably be pathological, and the interaction of these different factors of the cells, of the cells of multiple types, and the neurochemicals, and the electrical potentials that they induce. This interaction is all important for how the brain works. It's like gears in a clock. They all work together, and you can't take one of them out.
Right. Well, and a lot of that, according to your book, the stimuli, so to speak, that's very important. The environment in which this occurs has tremendous effects, and you bring up some very surprising facts along this line with certain conditions, for example, that we have treated as solely in the brain, but you're saying, no, this is anchored out here. So PTSD, schizophrenia, a whole lot of things that we have sort of isolated. Is that true?
Yeah, well, so as I said, I mean, I kind of cite examples of how people view the brain as different. And the example of the computer-like brain is an example of how people think the brain is different in its substance. People also talk about its extraordinary complexity, and that's another way in which the brain is distinguished in its substance. But what you're calling attention to is a different type of distinction, a brain-body distinction that relates to how the brain works, how it causes things. And one of the big ideas that's sort of circulating around these days is the idea that what we do, and in particular pathologies in what we do, are caused by defects in the brain. So you cite the example of schizophrenia. That's an example where a lot of people want to think of schizophrenia as being caused by the brain.
Yeah,
exactly.
right.
And the dark truth of the matter is we don't really know all that much about what causes schizophrenia. We know that it's largely genetically determined in the sense that if you look at what are called heritability studies, you can find roughly 80% heritability of schizophrenia, meaning that about 80% of the kind of cases of schizophrenia can be explained by variation in our genes. Now, how that actually crops up is rather uncertain. So in particular, saying that there's a biological cause or a genetic cause to schizophrenia doesn't enable you to predict, well, when is somebody going to have a schizophrenic episode?
Right,
exactly.
Yeah.
Moreover, we know very little about the specific defects that are causing schizophrenia, what comes in between the genes and the mental phenomenon. So one of the things that I talk about in the book a fair amount is the idea that actually a lot of mental phenomena actually relate to coupling between our brains and our bodies, and also our brains and our environment. If it involves human behavior, somewhere the brain is involved, that's for sure. But that doesn't mean that it's causative. And one of the actually really interesting examples about schizophrenia that I cite is a study of mental disorders in urban areas. It's a classic study from the 1930s that showed that cases of schizophrenia are actually markedly higher in urban areas. And people to this day, so those findings, although they're old, they're not necessarily wrong, and they've actually been reproduced. They've been reproduced repeatedly, and people still don't really understand why that is. It may have to do with an environmental effect. Many of the most obvious ideas have been ruled out, like that people who have mental problems move into the cities.
Urban.
Exactly right. I mean, that is sort of an obvious, what we call confound, and that doesn't seem to be true.
Right.
One of the other things that I talk about is the idea that there may be peripheral bodily causes. So by peripheral, I mean outside the brain. So I'm still brain-centric here. And that these things may be causing mental disorders also. And a couple of the examples I cite there are famous older examples from history. So in particular, if you looked at an insane asylum, an out-of-use word now, but an insane asylum from the 19th century, you'd find that probably the greatest single population of patients were people who had syphilis, a bacterial disease.
That's right. Yes, right.
It's a famous and well-studied fact that one of the gravest mental disorders of the 19th century and 18th century as well was actually caused by a bacterial disease that now we can treat with antibiotics.
Right.
And in a way, it sort of cuts both ways. I mean, this example tells us two interesting things. One interesting thing, and I think this was formative in the field, is that, of course, at least that mental disorder, it was called general paresis. It was essentially it's sort of a dementia-like complex of behaviors.
But they thought it was in the brain,
the head. Well, they didn't. No, they didn't. So back then they thought it was in the soul. Actually, yes. And in fact, moral turpitude was sort of generally viewed as the dominant cause for mental disorders. In fact, if you look at admissions records to a 19th century asylum, you might see causes for men that include moral destitution, masturbation. I mean, all kinds of horrible
homosexuality.
Homosexuality.
Actually, that lasted a long time.
Until the 1950s, homosexuality was it was actually listed in the first diagnostic manual. DSM. DSM, the famous manual of psychiatric diseases. So both these examples, I mean, they're somewhat different. So the example of syphilis causing mental disorder tells us that, okay, well, mental disorders are biological in some way.
Right.
Okay. But it also tells us that they needn't be caused by agents in the brain.
Right.
The brain is involved.
Right.
It's
but it's a physical thing.
Exactly. And so that's why, if you look at sort of now the modern landscape, where there's this great movement to essentially redefine mental diseases as brain diseases, that movement misses out on something.
That was a really good point.
Yeah, and I think I think more and more people are realizing this now. It misses out on many potential causes for mental disorders, as well as multifactorial situations where, okay, well, maybe we are in the, maybe we have the genes that predict that we should have schizophrenia, but, well, what's causing us to have an episode?
Yes.
Or what's making the difference?
Or why is it that not everybody gets it? That who may have a disposition, but that like that urban thing, a PTSD might be another example.
Well,
I'm
PTSD
not sure.
is a great example of a mental condition that is not caused by genes, that is related to our brains.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But I meant that you may be some may be more disposed to it than others.
Oh,
but
sure.
also,
right.
we're very kind and gentle about this situation now. But you want to say you need to look at this more broadly. I think that you still have a little problem.
There are a couple of reasons why I think it's really important to look more broadly, and it has to do with more than just sort of realizing that there are multiple causations. I mean, that's all well and good, but it's also sort of ivory tower-ish, right?
Yeah.
But what does it mean for actual people, patients in particular? Well, one thing it means is that it might help us combat the stigma. So one of the key issues, as you know, for mental disorders is the stigma of facing your community, facing yourself, actually, when you believe that you have a mental disorder. And a lot of people, I think, thought that, okay, well, by redefining mental disorders not as kind of moral problems, but as brain diseases, we could view them the way we might view having a cold. But that's not the truth. And part of the reason for that is, in fact, this kind of mystique of the brain that actually, okay, if there's something wrong with our brains, we don't just take that the same way that we would take, a kidney disease or something else.
Right.
It's actually special, and that's because we identify with our brains in a way that we don't identify with anything else.
Yeah.
So self-stigma is a big problem for people who've been diagnosed with mental illness, and the sense that they've got a broken part, in particular, a broken brain,
a broken self,
a broken brain, a broken self located in the brain is a hugely important issue, and while it may be true for some people that there are brain lesions or that there is something that is different about their brains compared with someone who hasn't been diagnosed, or the average person, I should say, who hasn't been diagnosed with whatever the condition is. The truth is much more nuanced and variegated than that, right? It's always the brain in a context. The context involves both the body of the person and the environment around them, including society, including inorganic aspects of the environment. One of the examples I discuss, which is well known, about how the environment affects our minds, is the example of SAD, seasonal affective disorder. And here we are in the northeast of the United States, and
we are sad
I only got to a point of the year where I can wake up and the sun has already risen, and I feel the effects of light deprivation on my mood, on my personality, and if I have biological predispositions of a certain sort, that environment might not work for me.
Yes,
and I think what's important is that people recognize that there is this interaction and that it's not just one thing. The other thing, in addition to the issue of stigma that is very important, is how we view treatments.
Yeah.
So it's difficult, of course, to make an assessment of, why do people choose the different treatments that they choose, but nevertheless, it seems to be documented that a rising awareness of the importance of the brain for mental disorders has coincided with a rising use of pharmacological treatments for mental illness, as opposed to other treatments like talk therapy, behavioral therapy, and so on. And while I'm not a doctor, and I don't have sort of a horse in that race, I can say that if one of the reasons why you're taking a drug for your condition rather than talk therapy is because you think the drug acts on the brain, whereas the talk therapy doesn't, that is wrong. And part of, I think, the value in appreciating that the brain is sort of, in a sense, a transducer. I use the word prism in the book. It's a prism through which multiple influences refract. And one of the reasons why we should see that is that when we have our conversation, when I have an interaction that alters my behavior or influences my behavior, that is just as brain-centric as a drug is.
Yes, right. I would like to ask you in our remaining time too about some other things that you have touched on, and one of these that's very popular right now is the whole idea of brain hacking, and then the transhumanist trend too, which is just fun, but it can be very eerie. But could you tell us a little bit about that, what you've said about that?
Yeah, well, so, I live in a world at MIT that is very into technology of all sorts, and in fact, I actually direct a center that is a center of neurotechnology. Now, MIT, we don't have a medical school, we don't see patients, and actually our neurotechnology is about largely about tools for studying the brain, which is something I think we all share a commitment to, regardless of where we think our species is going, or at least all of us in the center. But there are a lot of increasing numbers of voices, I think, out in the public sphere, as well as even at the university, who are interested in kind of enhancing human existence by enhancing the brain.
Right.
And there are many people who actually take a really dismal view of that stuff. And I have to say that I personally don't find it especially attractive. But what I discuss in the book is the idea that actually a lot of the feelings about enhancing the brain, enhancing cognition through enhancing the brain, or even in some cases gaining immortality by analyzing the brain or freezing it, that a lot of the fascination with that actually comes from the same kind of cerebral mystique that I discussed. There's this idea that, okay, well, the brain is special. It's special both in its makeup and in its causal relationship to the world, and it encapsulates our essence. There's this phrase that's used, "we are our brains." It's sort of figures in popular science writing, and it actually, it's actually a very old idea. I mean, from the times when people were debating whether the brain was the center of the mind or the heart was. People went all the way because it's easier to go all the way when you have an idea. So when you believe that we are our brains, then clearly the future of the future of us, is somehow going to be dependent on this. And one of the movements I think that's quite rife these days is this idea that, okay, well, we should be making implants so that our brains could communicate better with the outside world. And
chips for memory?
Exactly, chips for memory enhancement. Of course, I have a chip for memory enhancement, and I don't know if I'm allowed to do this, but it's over here. And of course, many people are very conscious of this fact, and that's actually mainly what I call attention to in the book, which is that they're peripheral analogs of almost anything that you could imagine doing with the brain. They're already there. We drink coffee to enhance our cognition. We
take pills for concentration.
Yes. Well, okay. Well, we take pills for concentration. we also take pills to remove headaches and indigestion, and all those things have cognitive effects as well.
Right, yes. Good,
we have aids that include our phones that allow us to look things up obsessively on Wikipedia, which is what I do. We also have aids that work around our brains even more kind of circuitously. So here we are in the Boston area, and I like to cite the fact that, okay, well, if we want to enhance the cognition that relates to driving.
Oh, well, this is a wonderful thing. Go ahead.
It may be that the best way is actually just to leave our brains out of it. There are people in the military who are interested in having soldiers be able to fire missiles faster from when they're piloting drones remotely or whatever. But actually, the best way to do that may be just to have the computer do it. I mean, that's something that's, of course, widely recognized as well.
Yeah.
But, I think the extent to which gaining independence of the brain might actually be a good thing for many of the cognitive tasks we want to solve in society is something that I think let's say, could be better realized.
Right. The other we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I really wanted to get this in, that there are manipulations out there. There are two kinds. I don't know how quickly you could address those, but the one, and you mentioned the military, is certainly interested in this, but things like torture, but optogenetics ultimately could go that way. These kinds of things where the brain can be actually manipulated, that's physically. The other is left over from time immemorial, in which you have biases in, what do I want to say, belief systems, and now social media, kind of propagandizing your brain, your ideas.
Well, I think
so. There are the two things. What say you?
Well, I mean, there's a lot to say, of course, but I think optogenetics is a tremendously powerful technique for studying the brain, because you can go in there and not into a human brain, but into an animal's brain, and try to determine in a causal way, sort of what the effect of an intervention at a particular point is. Now, as a tool for behavioral manipulation, well, it becomes sort of, a lot more questionable whether this is something to do. There is, of course, hope that certain neurological conditions could be treated with that kind of intervention. So, for instance, Parkinson's disease, which is relatively commonly treated with deep brain stimulation with electrodes, it might be that a better version of that could come about through optogenetics, although the field is nowhere near actually achieving that. Now, the fact of optogenetics and brain stimulation technologies more generally, the fact that these things exist, I think may encourage people to worry that actually there is going to be mind control that's made possible by these kinds of technologies. And one of the things I would say, and I do say in the book, is that in a sense the worry about that is perhaps exaggerated precisely for the kind of reasons that you gave, namely, well, we've always had mind control through propaganda, through torture, which is a behavioral therapy of a certain sort.
Of all sorts.
Exactly. So what I argue in the book is, well, people worried about inequality in our society because of the use of brain technologies. They're also worried about brain technologies falling into the hands of Big Brother in some way. And that's well enough. I mean, I would worry about those things. However, to the extent that we are worried about those things, we should worry about the modern analogs of those things that are going on right now.
Yeah.
And I think the distinction between brain technologies and peripheral technologies is overplayed, and that is a phenomenon of the cerebral mystique. And I think it cuts both ways, both on the, on the side of the vogue, the kind of mystique for brain hacking, and on the side of the fears about it.
Okay, I have just one more thing there.
Yeah.
This is almost a fun thing, except that it's taken very seriously. And in this area, there are groups like this, the transhumanists, and the idea that you're just going to lift your brain up into something or other, and there it is, eternal. What is that movement like? Is this a part of the cerebral mystique?
So I think that it is related, closely related, and actually just a couple of weeks ago, there was some press about a company that's offering to freeze your brain. It's the second company, at least that I'm aware of, that's doing this. That
just
you know,
your brain.
Exactly. So it's going to come up to you as you're dying, and you know, kind of inject you, or the word is perfuse you with a certain type of substance. Take your brain, and it's going to store it in you know, liquid nitrogen or something like that, until the technology is available to totally, you know, minutely scan it in some way, probably using a form of microscopy, to work out all the connections in your brain and to try to reconstruct your mind based on that. And I think that's a product of the cerebral mystique in more than one way.
Yeah.
You know, the most, you know, the broadest way is that, of course, the reduction of the person to their brain is inherent in that approach. And I think that that's scientifically wrong, in the sense that, you know, well, there are a lot of things about your body that influence your emotions, that influence your personality, the way you look, and of course the way that you interact. And, you know, just a brain, you know, sitting by itself in a vat is not going to have your life unless you have also uploaded all those other things.
It's like your
and
culture, your
exactly.
food, everything.
And you could do that. You could do that, and maybe one day that will be a possibility. I'm not quite sure what it's for, but then again, what is anything for?
Well, in looking at that, though, I just thought, I was very glad you had done that, because that immediately reminds me of the soul. We're right back there at the beginning, this isolated thing, this entity that is, you know, completely separated from the body, from its culture and everything else.
That's
it's very special. And so it's well done. I want to say, in closing, I wanted to talk about several other things. I'm afraid we're out of time, but maybe you'll do it again. Maybe we'll do a repeat. And in the meantime, I'd like to say, I think that your book event at the Harvard Coop, which was scheduled for last week, whenever it was the snow came in Boston, of course, then is rescheduled for, I believe it's next Tuesday the 2nd. Is that for Monday or Tuesday?
I think it may be
it's next
Monday
week.
the 2nd.
Monday, okay,
yes,
Monday.
yes,
But it's the
yes,
2nd
I'm confused
of
about
April.
those things too.
And I hope we'll get this up, but I do hope that people in the Boston area will feel free to go. This Harvard Coop, and you get to talk to Dr. Jasanoff and buy the book. But also, this is really very interesting reading and very important at this time. So I hope that other people will enjoy this as much as I did, and keep writing for,
well,
for
thank
sure. Dr. Jasanoff, thank you very much for coming and for giving us all this wonderful information.
Thanks so much for having me.